Well, I like where he positioned that ball calf. If you don't know what that is, it's obviously Syracuse, clearly where he went to school, and clearly an important part of his identity and what has led to his rocket launch of a sports media career. It is Bryan Williams, president of Bryan Williams Television, and you can see him working as a director, as a producer in television, also an event producer. And he joins me on the On to Something podcast. I am Bryan Fenley with Fox Sports Radio, also tennis golf broadcaster, and excited to have you on, Bryan. I haven't even asked the first question yet, but I feel like I already know the underlying theme of this conversation, and it's going to be the adventures of Bryan Williams as we dive into your life. And as I sort of welcome you in here, keeping with that theme of being someone who loves adventure, I got to start here. How did that play into your daughter studying archaeology and going down that route with her career?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Bryan, for having me on. I watched a bunch of your shows, and you have a lot of my friends and really good broadcast professionals on your show, and it's quite an honor to be on with those guys. It's nice to join the roster of your show, so thank you. Well, my daughter Erin, just cut me off if I go too long on talking about my daughter Erin. Yeah, we moved down from New York to Raleigh, North Carolina 18 years ago. And she ended up going to App State and getting a dual degree in anthropology and religious studies. And a couple of years later, she calls Janice, my wife, and I, and said, I got accepted at my #1 master's school to study archaeology. And we're thinking, okay, Chapel Hill or someplace local. And she says at Tel Aviv University. And we're thinking, Tel Aviv in Israel? Yeah. And I guess if you're going to study archaeology, you go to where it all began, right? And a year later, she had her master's degree in archaeology. And while there, did some of the crazy things she does, like she's a hiker, like she's done the App Trail, and she did the Jesus Trail 10 days in the Israel desert, pitching a tent by herself. And she's all of 4'11" and 105 pounds. And I know we've all done crazy things in our early days, but Erin has done that and survived it and didn't tell us about it till afterwards. So.
Quite the surprise, but I'm sure you're very happy for her. So she got an extra degree. And I feel like, understanding your experiences, it's like you have not just a master's degree, but you've got like a PhD in a way, as we kind of dive into it. And you being a father and you understanding the role that is in a child's life, I want to take us to a documentary you did in 1997 with Tiger Woods. And Earl Woods, his father, you being a father, and then understanding what that man was all about. We talk about the role that you played in your daughter's life, the role that he played in Tiger's life. Can't even begin to put into words what it was like. And for you to try and get that on tape and get Earl Woods to speak for this documentary that was on CBS, what did it take for you to do that?
Yeah, well, that was like the second step in the way this show came together. And that was such a critical point because the guy created, that's Tiger's his kid. And from the, we all know the stories of Tiger watching Earl hit balls into the net in the garage when Tiger was 6 months old, sitting in the high chair. But just taking a step back there, it was 1996 that Tiger turned pro, and Mark McCormick, the great Mark McCormick, owner and founder of IMG, signed him to a deal in August that year to turn pro. I mean, he had a great amateur career, winning 3 juniors and 3 amateurs, and was the greatest amateur player of all time. So Mark decided, 6 months into Tiger's pro career, that we needed to do a show on Tiger Woods. And I didn't know it at the time, but he had already done a deal with Sean McManus, president of CBS Sports, who was my boss at IMG for 3 years. before this took place, and he had just left to go to CBS. And Mark and he decided that they were going to do a show on Tiger Woods that would air on the Sunday before the Masters the next year in 1997. It was the first of these shows that CBS does now, leading into the final round of the Masters. And I had been with IMG for 6 years or so, and was vice president and executive producer. I did run the production operation in New York. And Mark McCormick walks into my office in November of 96 and says, we're doing this show on Tiger Woods, and it's going to air on CBS before the Masters. I'm thinking, okay, Tiger's just been a pro for like 4 months. He's won the Las Vegas Open. He only made the cut as an amateur once in his 2 tries at the Masters, and he's a rookie on the tour. Okay. And Mark said, well, that's what you got to convince him to do. I said, what do you mean I have to convince him? He goes, well, December 17th, you're going to be talking to Tiger, Earl, Sean will be there, I'll be there, and Team Tiger is agent, and you're going to make a presentation, and you got to convince Tiger to do this show. And your reward is, if you convince him, you get to play 18 holes of golf that afternoon. So I said, that's all the motivation I need. Anyway, so I put together the presentation, and I really didn't know what I was doing. To be honest with you, I mean, I had some pictures and I had some graphs and I had some, a list of the people we were going to be talking to. But back 25 years ago, there was no analytics. I mean, I couldn't tell them who was going to watch it and how much money they were going to make, whatever. So I went into that room. It was at the Islewood Golf Club where Tiger was living, and played golf every day there. And Earl was there, and Tiger was there, and Sean and Mark McCormick and Team Tiger, the lawyers and everything else. And I made my presentation. But before I walked into the room that day, Mark pulled me aside and said, hey, you'll do well. Just make your presentation. But keeping one thing in mind, in the end, Earl's going to make the decision. He's going to decide whether Tiger does this show or not. So I focused on everybody in the room, but my eye contact 90% of the time was with Earl, and he was there. So, my pitch was, we were going to talk to the greats of the game, Jack and Arnie and Byron Nelson. We were also going to talk to Charlie Sifford, the first Black player to ever play a PGA Tour event, to kind of tell us what Tiger was up against. Phil Knight with Nike on the new deal with Nike, and other players, Fred Couples and Davis Love, his contemporaries at the time, or the guys that were on the tour, the stars of the tour. But most important, I made it clear to him that I was going to have crews following him for the next 4 months, but we would give him his space. And as long as I was able to get 3 or 4 interviews with him, which I did myself, and talk to Earl, I said, we're good. So in the end, they agreed to do it, and I got a chance to play 18 holes of golf with him. And then your next question about Earl.
Yes.
I'll make this fairly short, but he was going to be the last interview. We had done everybody, and had everybody on the checklist done. And I wanted to save Earl till the end, because I knew, other than the interviews we did with Tiger, which were already on tape, Earl was going to be the key. I mean, he clearly loved this kid and created him and taught him everything. And they were, as Earl described it, best friends. So, I called him, and back then I was just making phone calls to Earl saying, we're going to be there Thursday, and he never answered, but I just left messages. And finally he picked up the phone 2 days before I called him to confirm. He said, I can't do it. I can't, things are going on, I can't do it. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? I said, Earl, you promised to do this interview, and this show doesn't happen without you. So we're going to be there Thursday afternoon at 2:00. And I knocked on the door Thursday afternoon. He opens the door. He goes, come on in. You got 15 minutes. So as it turned out, I didn't realize what was happening, but there were boxes all over the back of the house, in the living room and in Tiger's bedroom, because he shows the house, and Tiger's stuff was all being boxed up. Earl was leaving that day, separating with his wife, Coltita, Tiger's mom. They were separating, and he was moving out that day, and had all of Tiger's trophies and his medals and his sticks that he used as a kid. And he was leaving that day. He says, so you got 15 minutes because I got things I got to do. We sat down, and I had my pad of a yellow pad with a ton of questions. And he just got going, talking about creating Tiger, talking about the media pressure, talking about how he's going to have to deal with celebrity, how Earl made him tough, putting him through finishing school as he took, because Earl Woods was a special operations Green Beret in Vietnam, and he had his life saved. He described it like 5 different times by Vietnamese soldiers, and he made Tiger tough, and what Tiger was going to face he had faced racism in high school and elementary school, but Earl just went on, and just you could see how he wanted to tell the story of this Tiger Woods and how much he loved this kid. And 2 hours and 15 minutes later, I thanked him. I said, Earl, we got everything we need. It was great.
When you finished that conversation, so you went into it, you had gotten the no from him. You had to get there. You showed up at the house. You knew this had to be done. You weren't exactly sure how this was going to work out and how he was going to react. And so as you got into the house, as you saw him sort of unpeel the layers and really start to open up, what was he like when you hit the end of the record button, you ended the recording, and you sat there with him and spent that time together? What was different about how he sort of approached you and conversed with you then?
Yeah, it couldn't have been more gracious during the interview. I mean, I was prepared. I mean, I brought up quotes that he talked about Tiger. I mean, the first story I asked him about was Tiger as the story is, he was six months old and watching you hit golf balls, and he got right into the first story. He said, yeah, Tiger was actually 10 months old, 4 months into this whole thing, and I walked into, Coltita was making me lunch, and I walked in to get a sandwich. I come back out, and there's Tiger Woods. He had gotten out of the high chair and put a ball on the tee, and he was swinging and hitting balls, and put another ball at 10 months old. And most kids don't walk at 10 months old, right? He's hitting the ball, and Earl looked at him. He was hitting left-handed. And Earl let him do that for like 10 days. And then one day, 10 days later, Tiger turned around and stood from the right side. And Earl said, he was watching my mirror image of me hitting. And then he not only started addressing the ball right-handed, he changed his grip to a right-handed grip. 10 months old. And Earl said, right then he just hit 3 or 4 shots. I said, I have a genius here. And the whole interview went like that. He just loved talking about what he had in a kid.
The prodigy was born, and it's so interesting to see how kids, and how you don't think they're paying attention to the parents, even at that age, but everything they remember, and they want to copy, and they want to be just like. Brian Williams is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. So going from that conversation to another entity, another sporting event, and working the marathon in New York City. And it wasn't just the New York City Marathon, but it was the timing of this. We go back to 2001, and this was a couple of weeks after the attacks on 9/11. And here you are putting on this event, understanding the magnitude of the moment, the emotions, having to honor those who had passed, dealing with the security. How did you guys pull that off? What was it, 7 weeks afterwards in marathon?
Yeah, I mean, I still do the World Feed New York City Marathon. It's been one of my favorite events to do every year. And yes, as you said, 9/11 took place, and 7 weeks later, the New York City Marathon was to happen on the streets of New York City. Now, the Yankees and the Mets and the Giants and the Jets seasons had started, and they were playing ball. But it's different when you can metal detect everybody going into a stadium, and you can control the environment in a security sense. You can't do that in New York City, where 2 million people line the streets of New York to watch the New York City Marathon. And so, we went into security meetings and again, it wasn't going to happen until they made the decision 3 weeks before the event that they would run the New York City Marathon in 2001. And we had security meetings leading up to that with Mayor Giuliani and his staff, because if we were going to do this, we needed to have a helicopter in the air cover. You can't cover a marathon without air presence and a camera in a helicopter or a plane. And there was a no-fly zone still over New York City then. And so we went into meetings and we couldn't have this on the broadcast, but there were snipers on the buildings on First Avenue in New York and Fourth Avenue in Brooklyn, long stretches, and naval presence in the port of New York. And I don't know how true it was, submarines underneath the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, where 10,000 runners at any one time are on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in New York for the start of the New York City Marathon. But the main focus that day, once it was approved that we were going to do the show, and we wanted like every Emmy we could on this year, we decided that while we were going to cover the race, the lead pack and show, of course, it's Kenyans and Ethiopians and Mexicans and some Americans in that lead pack. We're going to show the race, but we needed to focus on the stories that made that day special. And that was the kids that were running for their dads that were killed when the bombs went off and the World Trade Center collapsed, both buildings, and the firemen that gave their lives in fighting those fires, other firemen running to honor them, and the policemen that died, when they went to the scene. And there's always the Mayor's Cup for every New York City Marathon, where the firemen and the policemen have a fun race. And that's a competition to win the Mayor's Cup, the firemen against the policemen of New York. We made that a special event that day. So there's just so many things that we did that made the show special. And that's what it was all about.
One of your many crowning achievements is putting that together, understanding the circumstances that you were presented with. I want to fast forward, say 10 years later. And as you had mentioned, you have been working in televising the New York City Marathon for quite some time. And am I getting this right, Bryan? You ran the race, but then you directed the opening ceremony or right beforehand on television. Like, who does that?
Well, maybe I'm the only one to ever do it, but it's a real sense of pride for me that 10 years after that, 2011, and I, in doing the show, and I first did it when I took over for the great Chuck Howard of ABC Sports fame and Wide World of Sports. He was my boss, executive producer at IMG, and he got sick in 1993, 94. So I took over as producer. So I had been producing the show for years, and I left IMG, and they brought me back to direct the start line. So in 2011, I was directing the start line. And the pregame show, we did an hour pregame show, and then I directed all four waves taking off, and I was basically done after that point. But a year earlier, I'm running the 5K with my daughter Erin, and she said, "Dad, you're not breathing too well. You can't keep up with me. What's the matter with you?" And as it turns out, I got checked out, and a few months later, I had a heart stent put in. My widowmaker, they discovered, was 99% blocked. And so I had it was pretty serious stuff. And I had a heart stent put in. And then I told the doc coming out of when I was coming to, I said, "I want to run the New York City Marathon a year from now. Can I do it?" And he said, "Well, you got another one that's blocked too. We're going to have to go back in there and you can treat that with another stent." So 2 months later, I had another stent put in. So I had two stents put in, and I got with my doctor, my cardiologist, and he said, "You can train, but I'm going to watch you for the next year." And so I got in good shape. I changed my lifestyle, cut down on stress, ate better, got in shape. And in 2011, I directed the pregame show and those four waves taking off. And I remember the final interview, we had to do an interview with Mario Lopez, and that was done. And I said, "All right, that's done." And I had my bib on and my sweats, and I was ready to run. And we took it to black, and I took off and jumped in the fourth wave and ran the race.
How are you feeling?
I don't remember that. I don't remember the last 4 or 5 miles, but I know I finished because I got pictures of me finishing the finish line and I have the medal. So I know
So
I finished.
you probably were in a haze when you crossed the finish line. How was your body feeling at that point from anything that you can recall?
I don't remember, but I went right to the medical tent and they checked me out and I was fine. Yeah. It was a good experience.
In a year's time, to go from that health scare to then running a New York City Marathon, just putting that into perspective, that is something that needs to be pointed out. And I'm glad we talked about it here. Bryan Williams is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley. So you've worked on world feeds with the New York City Marathon, but also the Masters, US Open. But let's go to the Masters. Let's go to how you are dealing with not just what we're doing from a network standpoint in the United States, but you're having to listen to all these other countries, and they have golfers from their respective countries that they want to feature. So I would think you have to have like 8 hands, like an octopus on the switcher if you're the TD here. But like, how are you able to appease the world on a feed when you've got 100 or more golfers on the course at a time before the cut?
Yeah. Well, I don't hit any of the buttons in those shows. That's way above my pay grade. But as producer of the show, basically, and this is typical in what you do with a world feed, because you're not just showing the pictures and the sounds to the American audience. You're taking that show and making it appropriate for the world. And as you said, in many cases, like the Masters, the Japanese TV was there, and the BBC for the Brits were there, and there were some other networks around the world that were there. But in most cases, in Denmark or in Sweden or other places in China or South America, they're calling the shows off of monitors in their hometowns. So it's up to the producer and director of a world feed to make it appropriate for them. And so for the Masters, which I did 22 years of the world feed, we're listening to and taking the pictures primarily from what Frank Chirkinian, the producer and then Lance Barrow from CBS. Yeah. And we're taking those pictures and cutting our own shots in and doing things when they go to commercial, because we didn't go to commercial, where we're showing international players. So, in 93, 94, 95, when Bernard Langer is winning the tournament, there's not enough shots of him, and Germany wants to see more shots of him. So every time we go to commercial, we made sure we updated the audience on what Bernard Langer was doing. And that's typical of what you need to do, whether it's a golf event or a tennis event. You need to make sure you're showing the international perspective of what's going on to the world, and not just focusing on the American players. And that's the same thing with a marathon. I mean, you want the local, the domestic show wants to feature those American runners, but in effect, those aren't the top runners. You have to show the international field to the rest of the world for a world feed.
The rest of the world wants to see that which they can relate to, those from their respective countries, and right. Getting to a perspective of what it's like in the truck, what it's like working with people. We understand that, from the outside, the broadcasters are going to get a lot of attention and they're going to get a lot of credit, and that's if they do a good job. And obviously it's very subjective, but then there's also the criticism that can come their way. Then you throw in the director and the producer. But I think about this old Roman military technique where I can't remember the name of it, but they would form sort of like, it was like they would put the shields around each other in a block, and then those in the middle would put the shields above. And so they would protect each other, and there were 50 soldiers there, and they would then run in to battle. There are so many people that are playing a part in these broadcasts that people lose sight of. And when you see what those people do, what moves you in understanding that just how grand of an effort it takes to put on one of these productions?
Yeah, that's a great analogy and a good question. like you say, we as producers, the guys on the front deck, the front bench,
Yeah.
the producers, the directors, and you in the booth. I mean, when people watch our shows, we get the praise. If it's a good show, they recognize you and how you called it. They recognize me and how the storytelling of it, right? And if it's bad, we're the ones that get the criticism as well. But I, I've always felt, and what I like to do in every show I do is make it a team event.
Yeah.
It is, television production is a team sport. I mean, we get entirely too much credit. Now, I have Emmys and I have them downstairs and I'm very proud of them. But I have them because somebody's name has to be put on the plaque of the Emmy, right? And somebody has to go up there and say nice things and thank the Academy or wherever for the trophy. But in effect, and this is why every event I do, I like to get the entire crew. At the US Open tennis, for instance, we bring everybody out for a team picture at the end. And it's not just the talent and the producers, directors, and associate directors and associate producers. It's the truck engineers. It's the guys that set up the lights. It's the transmission people. It's the tape ops and the graphic operators, because, we can do all the great planning and feature elements and production elements. And I'm not just the only one saying this. Most of the people in the good people in our business feel the same way too. It is all about that team effort. And if that mic doesn't work at that critical time, or if that camera goes down, or that cable wasn't run correctly, it doesn't happen. The story doesn't get out there to the world or to the American public. And I always like to bring the crew, everybody, to get that team picture so I can post it on Facebook or whatever, and thank the people that really made it happen. And it's not always a big crew. The US Open is a huge crew. The US Open tennis down in Australia, when we do the Australian Open, it's 20 of us and everybody's got a beer in their hand, right? But it's the same idea. I mean, I really think that, and I make a point of, after shows, of just going to everybody and saying, appreciate your effort, because it's a team effort. It's a team sport.
I love what you said there. Brian Williams is with me. I'm Bryan Fenley, because I think so much, and this is my experience, and a lot of people have shared these sentiments with me, in that you're doing a good job a lot of times in this business when you don't hear anything. And those who you referenced, who don't get the credit they deserve for their role in a broadcast, they don't get discussed unless somebody makes a mistake. Yeah, right. And that we take it for granted if things go smooth, and it's like they're not part of the picture. And kudos to you for taking the effort to go around the room and to acknowledge the sacrifices and the work that everybody is playing here. And I wish more people realize that just because something was great, people, compliments are healthy for people. They can brighten somebody's day. They can make them a better worker. So you're doing a big part in that. I want to leave you with this. I think we're going to have to do a part two, because we're definitely going to have to do a part two at some point. Last question here. You talked about the different tennis events that you've worked, the Australian Open, US Open. You've got one coming up this summer, Wimbledon. What am I going to see from you in England this summer?
Okay. Well, I tell you what, this may be dated by the time people watch this, but I mean, it's really a unique year in that, with the Russians and Belarusians being banned from playing Wimbledon, and the ATP and WTA tours coming out and say, all right, we're not going to give points to anybody, and Wimbledon cutting the prize money. I don't know what it's going to look like, quite frankly. But what I produce with them is the direct TV shows, where we take 5 different courts and create channels on direct TV through ESPN of each one of those channels. And our show is basically a studio show, where we're taking that 8 minutes from the time a match ends on any one court until the next match walks on, and we're creating content with it. And ESPN and Jamie Reynolds, his whole team, puts together just a great group of people and a great, feature elements and everything else. And Sam Gore and Luke Jensen, who host the show I do, are awesome at what they do. And we get everybody in. I mean, Chrissy Everett and John McEnroe and Patrick McEnroe, and everybody comes into our show to do segments. So to answer your question, I don't know what it's going to look like, but it's going to be entertaining and it's going to be first rate, like everything that ESPN Tennis does.
And like anything that you do. As Brian Williams joins me, I'm Bryan Fenley. Running out of time, we've got some things to talk about. So we'll definitely, when your schedule allows, would love to do a part 2. And going back to what you said about Wimbledon, you acting on the fly and handling that, we've seen you thrive in that setting over and over again. So even though there are a lot of unknowns coming in, there's no better person to handle that than somebody like you, given your experience and what you've done. Brian Williams, I'm Bryan Fenley. We do have a difference in spelling in our first name, but I'm not going to hold it.
Mine's the right way.
I was going to say, I'm not going to hold it up. I'm not going to hold it against you that you're an I and I'm a Y. But you know what? Brian's, they always stick together. Thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it, Brian.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.